Henry was a chameleon who was staying with grandfather along with Ruskin Bond as a child. Now let us come to the part. Although Henry did not cause any trouble in our house, he did create an uproar in the nursery school down the road. So, although Henry did not created any trouble, any disturbances in our house, he did create an uproar in the nursery school down the road. He had created a chaos, a confusion in the nursery school down the road. It all began quite innocently. So the matter started quite innocently. What was the matter? Let's see. When the papayas in our garden were ripe, grandmother sent a basketful to her friend Mrs. Ghosh, who was the principal of the nursery school. So when the papayas in our garden, in whose garden? In Ruskin Bond's garden, were ripe, grandmother sent a basketful to her friend, and who was this friend? Mrs. Ghosh, who was the principal of that nursery school. While the basket of papayas was lying on the table, Henry managed to slip in when no one was looking. So, when the basket full of papayas was lying on the table, Henry managed to slip inside the basket when no one was looking at him. The gardener dutifully carried the basket to the school and left it in Mrs. Ghosh's office. So the gardener very carefully carried the basket to the school and left it to Mrs. Ghosh's office. That means the principal ma'am's office. When Mrs. Ghosh returned to her office, she began to admire and examine the papayas. When the principal ma'am has returned to her office, she began to praise and test the papayas. Out popped Henry. Jumped out Henry from the basket. Mrs. Ghosh screamed. Henry looked up at her, both eyes revolving furiously. Mrs. Ghosh shouted loudly. Henry looked up at her, both eyes revolving, moving around furiously, quickly. Mrs. Ghosh screamed again. Henry's color changed from green to yellow to red. So as you all know that a chameleon can change its color so frequently. So over here Henry was changing its color from green to yellow to red. His mouth opened as though he too would like to scream. His mouth means Henry's mouth opened as if he also wants to scream like Mrs. Ghosh. An assistant teacher rushed in, took one look at the chameleon and joined in the shrieking. An assistant teacher rushed inside the room, had one look at the chameleon and joined in the shouting loudly. Henry was terrified. Henry was frightened. He fled from the office, running down the corridor and into one of the classrooms. So what Henry has done? Henry ran from the office, running down the corridor and went inside one of the classrooms. There he climbed onto a desk while children ran in all directions, some to get away from the Henry, some to catch him. There he climbed onto a desk while some of the children trying to catch him or run away from him. Finally, Henry went out of a window and disappeared into the garden. Finally, Henry went out of the window and vanished into the garden. Grandmother heard all about the incident from Mrs. Ghosh but did not tell her that the chameleon was ours. So, grandmother heard all the incident from Mrs. Ghosh but did not inform her that the chameleon was theirs. Grandfather and I did not think we would ever see Henry again. because the school was 3 houses away. So grandfather and I, means Ruskin Bond, did not ever think that we can ever see Henry again because the school was 3 houses away from their house. But 3 days later, I found him on the garden wall. But 3 days later, Ruskin Bond found him on the garden wall once again. After that, Henry spent the rest of his days in the garden and did not go on any more adventures. After that, Henry spent the rest of his days in the garden of Ruskin Bonds and did not went for any more adventures. So here we complete. This is the story from Grandfather's Private Zoo by Ruskin Bond. Hope you like it. Thank you. Now let us discuss few questions from inside the chapter to check what we have learned. Now students, tell me, who is Henry? Yes, Henry is the chameleon. Now can you tell me who has saved Henry? Yes, it is the grandfather who has saved Henry. How does grandfather came to see Henry? While the grandfather was visiting his friend's house, he came upon a noisy scene at the garden gate. People were shouting, throwing stones and waving sticks. The cause of this disturbance was a chameleon that had been sitting calmly on a shrub, right? Now, what does people say about Henry? People claimed that the chameleon could poison them 20 feet away simply by spitting at them. How Henry used to behave with the author? Henry trusted nobody and treated the author's friendly gestures with doubt. If the author used to tickle him in his ribs, Henry used to get very angry upon him. Now tell me, what does Henry used to do when the author put his finger inside Henry's mouth? If the author put his finger inside his mouth, he would simply wait for him to take it out again. He do not bite him at all. Now tell me how Henry used to take food from the author. If the author sits patiently, Henry would take food from the author's hands. This he did very swiftly, very fast. His tongue was a sort of boomerang which came back to him with the food and insect victim attached to it. So before the author knew about it, the food gets inside the Henry's mouth. Now what is Henry's remarkable possession? Henry's eyes were his remarkable possession. Why is it so? Henry's each eyeball bulging out of his head wobbled up and down, backward and forward. These movements made him appear very scary, very frightening. He could move one eye without disturbing the other. Now tell me how Henry used to behave in the author's house. Henry did not cause any trouble in the author's house, but he has created an uproar in the nursery school down the road. Now tell me, who has sent a basket full of papayas to whom? It is the grandmother who has sent a basket full of papayas to Mrs. Ghosh. Now who is this Mrs. Ghosh? Mrs. Ghosh is the principal of the nursery school. Now tell me what Henry has done with the basket. While the basket of papayas was lying on the table, Henry managed to slip inside when no one was looking at him. Now tell me what the gardener has done. The gardener dutifully carried the basket to the school and left it in Mrs. Ghosh's office. Now, students tell me what Mrs. Ghosh has done while returning to her office. When Mrs. Ghosh has returned to her office, she began to admire and examine the papayas. Now tell me how both Mrs. Ghosh and Henry has reacted at each other. Mrs. Ghosh screamed at Henry, while Henry has looked up at her, both eyes revolving furiously. Mrs. Ghosh screamed again. Henry's color changed from green to yellow to red. Right. Now tell me, how does the assistant teacher react? An assistant teacher who has rushed inside the room took one look at the chameleon and joined in the screaming with Mrs. Ghosh. Now tell me what Henry has done to disappear from the school. Henry was terrified. He gets so confused that he fled from the office, running down the corridor and into one of the classrooms. There he climbed onto a desk while children ran in all directions, some to get away from Henry, some to catch him. Finally, Henry went out of a window and disappeared into the garden. Right. Now tell me, does grandmother told the truth about Henry to Mrs. Ghosh? Grandmother heard all about the incident from Mrs. Ghosh but did not tell her that the chameleon was theirs. Right. Now tell me, how many days after Henry has returned? 3 days after Henry has returned. And where he has returned? He has returned to the author's garden, right? Now tell me how Henry has spent his rest of the life. Henry has spent the rest of his days in the garden of the author and did not go on for any more adventures. Right. Now can you tell me who is this author of the story? It is Ruskin Bond who is the author of the story. Now, can you tell me from which main story this story is a part of? The story is Grandfather's Private Zoo, from which this story is a part of, right? Now, these are the few questions that I have discussed with you. Hope you have understood.